The supposed photo of Josephine, wife of Wyatt Earp, is probably of another woman. The image, in a silk dress, became the cover of Glenn Boyer's book, I Married Wyatt Earp, 1976. Boyer said it was from 1880. However, the photogravure dates from 1914, registered with copyright as Coloma. Mistaken attribution spread from that edition. Texas Desperado no longer exists. This is how the newspapers recorded it. John Wesley Hardin, a gunfighter born of post-Civil War violence, fell at the Acme Saloon in El Paso when lawman John Selman shot him. The episode, on August 19, 1895, followed years of escapes and imprisonment. The obituary marked the end of a criminal career in the twilight of the Old West. Bill Doolin established himself as the most notorious outlaw in Oklahoma Territory. He began with the Dalton Gang and survived the Coffeyville shootout in 1892. A cabinet card from 1896, produced by W.B. Doherty and Guthrie, records his body riddled with buckshot, after action by U.S. Deputy Marshal Heck Thomas. At age 18, John Wesley Hardin recorded in his album the end of a cattle drive along the Chisholm Trail to Abilene, Kansas, 1871. The route had deaths. During the march, he killed 4 Mexicans, according to reports of the time. In Abilene, at the American House Hotel, he shot a man in the neighboring room, possibly for snoring. By the time he died in 1895, he had between 27 and 42 victims. Taken in 1907 in the Bolivian Andes, this is considered the last known photograph of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. In it, Cassidy appears mounted on his mule, while Sundance, beside him, adjusts tack and tends to his own animal. The image belongs to the duo's final period, already on the run and under surveillance by local authorities. Tom Horn, former scout in the Apache Wars, roping champion and Pinkerton agent, worked as a cattle detective in the Wyoming Wars. In 1901, he was arrested for the shooting that killed Willie Nickel, 14, perhaps mistaken for his father, Kells. In 1903 in Cheyenne, he awaited hanging while making horsehair riatas, as shown in the engraving by W.G. Walker. An albumin photograph records Pinkerton detectives in pursuit of the Wild Bunch Gang, 1900. On the left, Charlie Ringo, former cowboy in Texas and New Mexico, joined the agency in 1886 and published A Cowboy Detective in 1912. On the back, he noted his partner on the right, William B. Sayers, concealed in the book as W.O. Sales. Depicted in 1907 by Emerson Howe in The Story of the Outlaw, John Simpson Chisholm had been in the cattle trade since 1854. Between 1866 and 1867, he partnered with Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving, driving herds to the New Mexico Territory. His ranch years later sheltered Billy the Kid and regulators during the Lincoln County War in 1878. In 1864, at age 17, Jesse James joined his brother Frank in the Confederate guerrilla in Missouri, ambushing Union soldiers during the Civil War. After the war, he became a notorious robber. He would not reach 35. On April 3, 1882, at home, he was betrayed and shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford, a member of his own gang. Amid distrust of law and courts, the image records the remnants. In front, deputies Heck Thomas of Guthrie and Morris Robacker of Pawhuska, the latter also chief of the Osage Police. Behind them, Osage scouts spotted Dog Eater and Howling Wolf. In the last row, Clerk John H. Havighorst of Pawnee and Deputy Attorney General Roy Hoffman. Apache Kid, a San Carlos Apache, served as a guide for the U.S. Army in Arizona. In 1887, after a mutiny and shootout in San Carlos, he was convicted, escaped, and became the target of long pursuits by posses and rangers. He operated between Arizona and Sonora until disappearing. Accounts differ on whether he was captured or killed in the early 20th century. A cabinet card derived from a photograph taken in Nebraska City, Nebraska, around 1875. After Jesse's assassination, Taylor's Copying Company of St. Louis, Missouri, issued and spread copies, catering to public interest in images and to the commercial practice of reproductions. On a cabinet card around 1895 appears Roy Bean, who proclaimed himself Law of the West of the Pecos. As Justice of the Peace in Langtry, Texas, he held hearings in the Jersey Lily Saloon, setting fines and summary sentences based on state laws and his interpretation. His activity illustrates informal forms of frontier justice in the late 19th century. One of the Midnight Men, John W. Poe from Kentucky, migrated to Texas in the 1870s, worked as a buffalo hunter, and later became a lawman. In 1881, at age 31, the Canadian River Cattle Association hired him as a detective to hunt Billy the Kid and his gang. Poe fulfilled the mission by accompanying Pat Garrett to Fort Sumner on the night of July 14th, when Billy was killed. In 1848, Myra Maybelle Shirley was born, known as Belle Starr. In the younger gang, she married outlaws Jim Reed and Sam Starr. In 1886, a card by Roeder shows her posed alongside Deputy Marshal Benjamin Tyner Hughes. Arrested at Younger's Bend in May, she was taken to Fort Smith for robbery. Acquitted, her story changed when Sam died on December 17th. On November 9, 1867, the New York Times, in a report, described the Kiowa chief Satanta as endowed with cunning and diplomacy, as well as audacity and cruelty. In 1871, after the attack on Henry Warren's caravan at Salt Creek in northern Texas, the Warren Wagon train raid, Satanta, Big Tree, and Satank became the first natives tried in the U.S. in Jacksboro. William Clark Quantrill, mentor of the James brothers, led Quantrill's raiders in Confederate guerrilla actions along the Missouri-Kansas border, attacking Union detachments and towns. He was killed by Union forces in May 1865 in the final combats of the Civil War, leaving behind a tactical legacy that Frank and Jesse would later apply in their outlaw careers. Calamity Jane in Buckskins. Martha Calamity Jane Canary wore dresses like other frontier women, but memory comes from the 1895 card by Henry Locke and Charles Peterson, Deadwood, South Dakota. She claimed to be an Army scout, but was likely a camp follower. She inserted herself into the myth of Wild Bill Hickok and was buried beside him. In 1884, photographer A. Frank Randall made the first photographic records of Geronimo, Chiricahua healer and leader, at the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona Territory. Among the images, Geronimo kneeling, holding a Springfield 1873 carbine, stands out. The session was part of Randall's series and consolidated his public image. Who was the most notorious lawman of New Mexico? Many recall Pat Garrett. Among Hispanics, the answer is Elfego Baca. Garrett became famous for killing an outlaw in a darkened room. Baca, in 1884, resisted about 80 white cowboys, surviving nearly 4,000 shots and dynamite. After this siege, violence in Socorro came to an end. Portrait of William F. Buffalo Bill Cody, taken in the early 1870s, when he worked as a U.S. Army scout and buffalo hunter on the Great Plains. The image records the phase when his fame was growing on the frontier, preceding the traveling shows that years later would shape his public figure and the mythology of the Old West. In March 1886, photographer C.S. Fly of Tombstone, Arizona, accompanied General George Crook to the Mexican border to negotiate the surrender of Geronimo and his Chiricahua Apache group. In Canon de los Embudos, he made the only known photos during the war, including this one with men, women, and children. Behind them, mounted men. Ezra Allen Minor, known as Bill Minor, served time in the U.S. for horse theft and stagecoach robbery. Released in 1880, he returned to crime and became known as the Gray Fox. In 1904, he carried out in Canada what is considered the first successful train robbery. Oral tradition credits him with the command, "Hands up," now widespread in Western lore. Mysterious death. In July 1882, in Arizona Territory, Gunman Johnny Ringo was found dead near Tombstone, with a gunshot wound and his weapon at his side. Records and testimonies differ: suicide or murder. Wyatt Earp and Buckskin Frank Leslie claimed responsibility, but the evidence remains inconclusive. The last image of George Armstrong Custer, a cabinet card, was taken by William R. Howell in New York in April 1876. 2 months later, Custer would fall with part of the 7th Cavalry of the U.S. Army at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Attentive to his own image, he posed for more than 150 portraits. This one is part of his last session. Badman Brooks, or Billy Brooks, served as a marshal in Newton, Kansas, and later in Dodge City. After controversial shooting incidents, he left the law. In 1874, he drove stagecoaches for the Southwestern Stage Company. When the postal contract was lost, he joined a scheme to rob rival shipments. Captured, he was lynched by a mob on July 29th. Henry Starr, outlaw, played himself in the film A Debtor to the Law, 1919, recreating bank robberies. A distant relative of Sam, Belle Starr's husband, he received a pardon from Theodore Roosevelt after helping to disarm Crawford Cherokee Bill Goldsby in a failed escape. He made the film upon leaving prison. He returned to crime and died in a robbery in 1921. Frank Harry Leslie. McCubbin, strict about provenance, admits that the photo has no direct link confirming it to be Buckskin Frank. The identification is based on an authenticated photo. Buckskin Frank gained fame by killing Billy Claiborne, survivor of the OK Corral shootout in 1882, at the Oriental Saloon in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. Tom Blackjack Ketchum, an outlaw of the West, appears after his capture, already with his right arm amputated from wounds suffered while attempting to rob a Colorado and Southern train. On April 26, 1901, in the New Mexico Territory, he was hanged for that attempted robbery. Captured in 1899, the case illustrates the hardening of railroad law. A photograph preserved by the family portrays Seth Bullock, first sheriff of Deadwood, Dakota Territory. In 1876, he and Saul Starr moved to the gold rush town to open a hardware store. After the murder of Wild Bill Hickok by Jack McCall on August 2nd, one day after his arrival, Bullock imposed law in the mining camp. McCubbin recorded in his first historical photograph the sheriff of Lincoln County, Pat Garrett, known for killing Billy the Kid on July 14, 1881. The portrait was taken by James N. Furlow in Las Vegas around 1880, after Garrett captured the gunman in Stinking Springs, then New Mexico Territory, on December 23, 1880. California gold miner. Between 1848 and 1855, the gold rush attracted migrants of many origins and generated demand for portraits. Studio photographs in daguerreotype and ambrotype recorded workers posing with pans and pickaxes as proof of trade, for sending to relatives and for advertisements. Today they rank among the most sought-after images of the Old West. Known for the solitary capture of Bill Doolin in 1895, Deputy Bill Tilghman appears here in an earlier stage of his career. In 1883 in Kansas, he joined the group of authorities involved in the so-called Dodge City War. The conflict, centered on political and public order disputes, was resolved by agreements without shots fired or deaths. Dancer and European celebrity Lola Montez arrived in California in 1853 and spread the famous tarantula dance in the saloons of the gold rush. In the number, with strong theatrical appeal, she shook her dress to expel imaginary spiders, lifting her petticoats. The gesture, half theatrical, half burlesque, guaranteed immediate fame and fueled controversies. Probable historical error. The famous photo attributed to Josie, wife of Wyatt Earp, likely does not depict her. The image used by Glenn Boyer on the cover of I Married Wyatt Earp, 1976, was advertised in 1880. Research indicates it is actually a photogravure from 1914, published under the title Coloma, evidence of later commercial reuse. Richard Little Dick West, former member of the gangs of Bill Doolin and Al Jennings, alternated bank and train robberies in Oklahoma Territory. A fugitive, he was tracked by a posse of federal deputies. On April 13, 1898, near Guthrie, he fell under fire led by Bill Tilghman and Heck Thomas, ending his trajectory in banditry. At age 20, John Henry Holliday completed his degree at the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery. The carte de visite portrait by O.B. Morat, 1872, is one of the rare adult images of the future Doc Holliday, a gunman notorious for the OK Corral confrontation in Tombstone. The piece remained in the family, preserved by his cousin Matty for decades. Dan Thrapp, an expert on the Apache Wars, fixed Al Sieber's legacy in the 1964 biography Al Sieber, Chief of Scouts. Sieber, a German and Civil War veteran, led George Crook's scouts in Arizona during campaigns against the Chiricahua. In 1887, he was crippled after a shootout linked to the Apache Kid, marking the end of his career. Born in Texas in 1853, John King Fisher began as a cowboy on southern ranches. Arrested for horse theft, he served a short sentence and returned to the field armed. In the 1870s, he organized a band of outlaws on the border, self-proclaimed Ranger, who pursued and executed Mexican raiders in retaliation for incursions. Cattle Rustlers of New Mexico Territory. This cabinet card photograph, circa 1880, identifies the subjects only as horse thieves of New Mexico. Researchers suspect that the standing man is John Kinney, leader of a gang dedicated to horse and cattle theft in the territory, active in the 1870s and 1880s. Not the chief, you think. The label Manga's chief of the Warm Spring Apaches caused confusion. Many mistook him for Mangus Coloradus, a 19th century Apache leader in the U.S. Southwest. In fact, it is his namesake's son, photographed by A. Frank Randall in 1886. The Smithsonian holds an albumen copy from the collection of General Nelson A. Miles. In 1885, at William Notman's studio in Montreal, portraits were taken of Sitting Bull alongside Buffalo Bill Cody. The Sioux leader agreed to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West for 4 months. The images circulated as promotional material, marking the meeting of indigenous leadership in the entertainment industry. The Texas Rangers, a police force with state reach and national projection, date back to the Republic of Texas, before annexation to the U.S. In 1874, the Frontier Battalion was formed, with 6 companies. Company F, recorded on a cabinet card around 1885, exemplifies the organization and the patrol role on frontiers and routes. In 1821, merchant William Becknell opened the Santa Fe Trail, the first international route between New Mexico, then a Mexican province, and the western U.S. frontier. The circulation of merchants, soldiers, settlers, and freight caravans made the city a hub. In the early 1880s, the railroad reduced its use and the route became obsolete. Kidnapped at age 12 in Arizona Territory by Apaches, Felix Tellis followed an unusual path in the Apache conflict. He became a warrior and U.S. Army Scout, receiving the nickname Mickey Free. He lived as an Apache on the White Mountain Reservation until 1914. The 1888 photo is attributed to Daniel F. Mitchell and Irwin Bear of Prescott. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok is considered the first great gunfighter of the West. He gained fame in the 1865 face-to-face duel in Springfield, Missouri, against Dave Tutt, a confrontation that shaped the model for gunfights later filmed. In that same year, he appears in a carte de visite by Charles Schulten, carrying Colt Navy revolvers in cross-draw. Known as the Cowboys of the Massacre, taken around 1885, a cabinet card image by photographers Charles S. Baker and Eli Johnston in Douglas, Arizona Territory, shows real cowboys employed by Texas John Slaughter at the San Bernardino Ranch, near present-day Douglas in cross-border U.S.-Mexico cattle herding. The image records in 1903 a camp of lungers on the outskirts of Phoenix, tuberculosis patients who settled in tents, seeking in Arizona's arid climate a treatment then in vogue. There they followed routines of rest, sun, and dry air, in a time when medical resources were limited and migration for health shaped the region. The 1887 photograph by photographer John C.H. Grable includes in the copyright record the identification of the mounted cowboy as Fred Pierce, a famous cowboy of Wyoming. However, searches in the 1880 and 1890 censuses in the press of the time and in the Wyoming Territory Brand Book have not located this character so far. John Burwell Omohundro Jr., known as Texas Jack, gained fame on drives along the Chisholm Trail. He brought lasso acts to the stage with Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody, seen as a pioneer. In 1877, he created the Texas Jack combination. He died of pneumonia in Leadville, Colorado, a month before turning 34. In 1908, Cody commissioned a tombstone but recorded his age as 39. Highlighted clockwise from the upper left corner: Billy Richardson, Johnny Fry, Gus Cliff, and Charlie Cliff, riders linked to the Pony Express. The 1860 image records a group associated with the first express mail routes on horseback, a private service that operated between Missouri and California. Executing a warrant against horse thief Andy Cooper in Holbrook, Arizona Territory, Apache County Sheriff Commodore Perry Owens opened fire when resisted, killing Cooper and brothers Samuel and John Blevins and wounding another Blevins. Months later, in 1888, Emma Albright photographed him in Albuquerque, New Mexico Territory. Photographed around 1865, Tibio Vasquez became one of the most well-known Hispanic bandits of the American West. Between 1850 and 1874, he led stagecoach robberies, thefts, and cattle rustling. In 1874, reporter George Beers of the San Francisco Chronicle shot him. Captured, he was tried and hanged in 1875 in San Jose, California. In 1889, Manor in Travis County was consolidating as a small agricultural center in central Texas, with modest commercial streets and basic services that served surrounding farms. The official records of 1890 indicate 405 inhabitants, a number that shows a stable community integrated into regional supply routes. Many, when searching for a name of the Old West, recall Wyatt Earp, in part because of Bat Masterson. A former Army scout, sheriff, and Wyatt's partner, he told Theodore Roosevelt that only Earp could narrate the real West. Aide Stuart Lake heard this, sought him out, and in 1931 published a fictional biography. Part of the accounts attributed to Wyatt were Masterson's own experiences. Cabinet card of Ben Thompson. Studio portrait, 1875, printed and mounted on stiff card. It shows the notorious gunfighter and Austin police chief posed half-length in formal attire with a neutral background, a typical format of the period used for public sale and circulation in family albums. Mickey Free, Apache scout for the U.S. Army, appears around 1888 alongside his wives Ethle and Ochehe. Once kidnapped in childhood and later an interpreter among peoples, he took part in campaigns in Arizona. The image records family alliances according to Apache customs during a period of intense border tensions and in New Mexico. Mixed-race frontiersman. The identity of the portrayed man, recorded around 1850, remains undetermined. The daguerreotype, a rare piece, presents a man of mixed ancestry, possibly Metis, in work clothing, carrying a knife and an axe, signs of participation in the frontier economy in a zone of territorial contact and self-defense. Titled, "The True Cowboy Captured Alive," this 1880s cabinet card records on the left, Cottonwood Charlie Nebo alongside Nicholas Janis, a French-American settler in the Nebraska Territory. Sources place him as a descendant, or perhaps brother, of Joseph Antoine, interpreter at Fort Laramie in what was then the Wyoming Territory. Around 1890, a carriage is parked in front of the Beaumont Hotel in Ouray, Colorado, a stopover point for travelers and merchants connected to local mines. The scene records urban daily life in formation: wooden facades, dirt street, flow of guests and workers, and the hotel as a landmark of wealth and transportation networks of the period. Among the first records of a fur trapper, this daguerreotype of James P. Beckwourth, taken in 1850, was published in his biography released in 1856. Born in Virginia in 1778, the son of an enslaved mother and an Irish overseer, he traveled the West from 1824 until his death in 1866, working in the fur trade and on frontier routes. Peter Bogardus, born into a famous lineage of marksmen, wielded a Remington Model 1888 and carried another at his waist. Under the guidance of his father, Captain Bogardus, he joined, along with his brothers Eugene, Edward, and Henry, Shooting Axe in Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the traveling show that spread shooting culture at the end of the 19th century. Captain Jack Crawford, the poet scout, gained renown in the West as an Army scout in conflicts with indigenous peoples. Later, he toured stages and schools, published poems and travel accounts, and advocated civic education. His works blended memory and exaltation of the frontier, influencing the image of the West. Portrait from 1881. Rare image of a buffalo hunter. Although the slaughter was common in the Old West in the United States, almost no visual records of the hunters themselves remain. This cabinet card, dated around 1880, portrays a man posing with a Sharps rifle, typical equipment of the time, in the Payne and Stockdorf studio, Leadville, Colorado. Between 1835 and 1885, former Texas Rangers, known as 49ers, acted as mercenaries along the border. In exchange for official payments, Mexican state governments hired private companies to suppress Apache and Comanche raids. The human scalp became proof of service and a source of income for these groups in a violent market. In 1845, French gunsmith Louis-Nicolas Flaubert presented the first single-piece cartridge, a metal capsule combining primer, powder, and projectile. The innovation abolished the separate use of components and set the model that, in common usage, we call a bullet, guiding the transition from loose load to standardized ammunition in portable firearms. Capture of the Northfield robbers. On September 7, 1876, the James Younger Gang failed in its attempt to rob the Bank of Northfield, Minnesota, with members captured. The carte de visite made by Ira E. Sumner, typical of portraits of prisoners and the dead, is said to have circulated by the thousands. Today, few copies survive in public and private collections. Resident of the Bottom, the bullwhacker in the photo, C. 1850, brandishes the whip used to drive oxen hitched to freight wagons. A central profession practiced by men and some women, it kept convoys moving and ensured commercial flow before the railroad. Despite their importance, these drivers occupied the lowest rung of the social hierarchy. Although the photograph bears the caption Arizona Rangers, analysis of the clothing, low crown hats, short coats, and cartridge belts typical of the 1870s-1880s, suggests it was taken in the late 1870s or early 1880s, when Arizona was still a territory. The official Arizona Rangers Corps would only be instituted in 1901. At the end of the 1870s, Samantha Fallon managed the San Jose House Hotel and a millinery shop in Tombstone, then Arizona Territory. A cabinet card made by C.S. Fly around 1879 records her image. Pointed out as the partner of Ed Schieffelin, she ended up marrying Zachary Taylor on December 14, 1880. Carte de visite, dated 1878, with the portrait of Charles Baudry and his wife Manuela. The copy, stained with blood, was taken from Baudry's body after the confrontation at Stinking Springs, New Mexico, on December 23, 1880, when Lincoln County Sheriff Pat Garrett shot him, and in the same action, captured Billy the Kid. The James Younger Gang, active in Missouri and neighboring states between the 1860s and 1870s, included Jesse and Frank James and the Younger brothers. Born from the post-Civil War era, It specialized in bank and train robberies. Press publicity and Pinkerton pursuit expanded its fame until the Northfield fiasco in 1876 in Minnesota. In March 1886, during the negotiations between General George Crook and Geronimo in Canon de los Embudos, Sonora, photographer C.S. Fly recorded an Apache wearing a three-piece suit. Fly or his wife identified him as Apache Kid, an identification supported by William Sparks. Historian Granville Stewart, however, contested, "It is not the Kid." In 1887, Cherokee leader Ned Christie was accused, without evidence, of murdering Federal Deputy Marshal Dan Maples. Pursued for years in Indian Territory, he resisted successive sieges. In 1892, an armed band killed him, dynamiting his hideout. Afterwards, lawmen tied the corpse to a door and posed for photos, displaying him as a trophy. Around 1900, in Beaumont, Jefferson County, the Père Saint grocery operated under the ownership of Melton Bowie. Recognized as one of the city's first African-American entrepreneurs, Bowie played a prominent role in local commerce. Records cite his skill as a carpenter, a reputation that supported his work in various trades. Deadwood in Dakota Territory was a growing mining camp. Muddy streets, tents, and saloons in rows, the sound of gold pans in the creek, and armed vigilance. When Wild Bill Hickok arrived around 1876, the gold fever was attracting migrants, merchants, and gamblers, and formal authority was fragile, maintained by local committees. The image shows Harry Yount, the mountain man, posing at the top of Berthoud Pass in the Colorado Rockies, around 1874. At the time, he worked as a hunter and guide. Years later, he would be recognized as the first park ranger of Yellowstone. The scene indicates the phase of exploration that preceded the formalization of park protection.